If you can hear me, wave your hands. Just okay. So we have sound and we are on YouTube. So I would like to begin by, what do we say? I would like to begin by wishing you all a good day, good evening, good morning, whichever time of the day it is for you, whenever you happen to be listening to this. And we will begin today, as usual, by reciting the Vajradhara, not the Vajradhara, we'll begin by reciting the prayers for refuge and bodhicitta. So please recite these prayers with great faith and devotion. O sangye chudan tsoge chonam la chancho bardo dane chapsum che dagi jinso gibe sunam jidola penjir sanje dubar sho sangye chudan tsoge chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum je dagi chenyen gibe sunam je rola penjir sanje robar sho sanje chedang soge chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum je dagi chenyen gibe sunam ji rola penjir sanje robar sho until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha Dharma and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Semjen tamje dewa tan dewe judan dembra juje donga dan donga ji judan rawa juje donga mebe dewa tamba tan min rawa juje nirin shada nitan rawa tanyon shembola nebra juje. May all sentient beings be happy and have the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be parted from the highest joy, free of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, free of attachment or hatred to those near or far. And now think to yourselves that we must bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space, to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood. And in order to do that, we need to listen to and study the, listen to and contemplate the Dharma, and then meditate on the Dharma. And so please listen with this motivation of bodhicitta if you are able, or at least have a good, as good a motivation as you can in listening to the Dharma today. The Dharma that we are listening to is the Treasury of Abhidharma by Vasubandhu, as explained by the 9th Karmapa Wangchuk Dorje in his commentary, Youthful Bliss. And so in the Treasury of Abhidharma has 8 chapters, and of the 8 chapters, we're speaking about the 5th chapter, the teachings on the kernels, the teachings on the afflictions. And so this is one of the most important chapters in this text, and so it's important to study it well. Of course, I think we've already been through the most important parts of the text. We've got just a little bit of the chapter left, but this is teaching things that are not directly related to things that we practice anymore. And so I'm going to go through the end of this chapter relatively quickly this morning. I'll do probably a little more than just read the rest of the text of the chapter and comment on a word here or there, but not go into detail for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not really part of what we practice or how we practice in the Tibetan tradition these days. And the second thing is that just given the limits of time, and I think it's something that's going to be of more help and benefit to people who have already got a basic foundation in the Abhidharma and then want to go through in much more detail. But since we're giving kind of a, what do you say, a basic level Abhidharma course right now, this material, it's actually not all that difficult. There aren't that many problems in there, but if you have to kind of be thinking about things in an Abhidharma sort of way to actually get a lot out of them. And the second thing is that just given the limits of time, therefore not send so much, what do we say? We will therefore not spend so much time on this chapter today, on that last part of the chapter. So the this fifth chapter has three main parts. The part on the nature of the kernels and what discards the kernels. We have completed those two. We're talking about the third, the results of discarding the kernels. And that is the point that we will begin with today. But before we do, I had a question that came in over email. And it was a long question. I'm going to kind of condense it. It had three questions, three main questions. And the first one is, why are the five obscurations not set as another classification of the kernels of the afflictions? It's like we have classifications into 6, 7, 10, 98, or into the 5 fetters, or the 9 fetters, 10, 10, what do we say? What are we calling it? I'm losing the words. The different classifications, the defilements, the fetters, the bonds, the entanglers, and so forth. So here, why are the 5 obscurations, which are the obscurations primarily to meditation, why are they not taught as a classification? It's because they're just a subset. All of the other classifications that we were speaking about before, especially the ones listed in the enumerations according to the treatises and according to the sutras, all of those kind of include all of the afflictions, but this only includes a small subset. That's the main reason why it's not taught as another classification. Now, the second question, which was actually went into quite a lot of length in the actual question, is like, how does it relate to the other, essentially, how does this relate to other sets of problems and obscurations or difficulties that we encounter when meditating? For example, we often have teachings on different qualities we need to develop for shamatha meditation, 6 impediments to shamatha meditation, or other obscurations. And they're slightly different lists, or they're lists of things that we need to do that seem to kind of correspond to this in the meditation. So what is the relation to these? And basically the relation is that they're all talking about the same thing. They're all talking about how to develop meditation and what the problems and how to deal with problems that come up with meditation. But they teach them in different ways. There are many reasons for teaching them in different ways, but the specific one is that when people are teaching, or if they're teaching a specific person or a specific group of people, they're going to teach what that group of people needs. Also, sometimes, like a master will have one meditator will have a lot of experience in one way, and then when he or she teaches the next set of students, then they're going to have something else to say. You can say something slightly differently. Same meaning, different words. So that's how it relates to all the other traditions. Another way to look at it is that this is the teaching that comes up over and over again in the sutras that the Buddha himself taught, the 5 obscurations. And it comes up in many, many texts after that. So it's important to know that, because when you read other texts, you want to know what's going on. This is one of the main reasons for studying the Abhidharma, so that when you start reading sutras and treatises and so forth, and they say the 5 obscurations, you'll know, okay, that's what it is. Okay. And then the third of the questions is, what about the obscurations? They're usually afflictive and cognitive. Is there a link here between the two? So generally, especially in the Mahayana, we talk about 2 obscurations. We talk about the cognitive and afflictive obscurations. Sometimes in the Mahayana, we talk about 3, the cognitive, afflictive, and the obscurations to absorption, 3. There are different ways of looking at the obscurations. So basically an obscuration means something that hides or impedes something else. And so because these have the function of impeding developing meditation, that's why they're described as an obscuration. So it's one of those many instances where you have a word that is used in different ways. Like, for example, the word truth. The word truth can either refer to the four truths or the two truths. And you just have to kind of understand from the context, which of the truths are we talking about? So when you hear them saying the 5 obscurations, then you remember, okay, these are 5 problems that prevent me from meditating. When you hear them talking about the 2 obscurations, say, okay, the afflictive and the cognitive obscurations. When you hear them talking about the 3, the afflictive, cognitive, and absorptive obscurations, and so forth. These are just different ways of looking at it. So the word is the same and the function is similar, which is why that word is used. But it's a slightly a different thing than when you're talking about the 2 or 3 obscurations in the Mahayana. So that is that section. So we will now resume with talking about the third of the topics, the result of discarding the kernels, which are the 9 perfect knowings. So we'll just go through this fairly quickly. The section on the 9 perfect knowings has 2 main parts. Or 5 main parts. The classification of the results, which we described yesterday. Let me go back and show you that topic. It's easier. So here we are, the 5 topics. I'll highlight them temporarily. The classifications of the results, which perfect knowings are the result of what, establishing their quantity, how they are possessed by individuals, and forfeiting and attaining. So how they can be lost and then regained, or how they are gained. So these are the 5 topics here. So the classifications here we described the other day. We spoke about them as being the 9 different perfect knowings. The important thing here is that what the word perfect knowing means is that you have kind of known something fully, known a particular class of things to discard fully, and as a result, you have discarded them. So you've got 2, so the word means 2 things. It means both the knowledge, the wisdom, that's the perfect knowing bit, but it also refers to the result, which is the abandonment or the cessation of those. And so here it's primarily talking about the cessation. That's the main thing that we're speaking about. So yesterday we spoke about the classification of results. So today we'll begin with which perfect knowings are the result of what. That's here on the bottom of what I'm showing you now. And this has 3 points. So which are the results of the knowings and forbearances? So the knowings and the forbearances are different types of wisdom you have on the path. So here, and this is at the bottom of page 427 in the book. The 6 are the results of forbearance. The rest are the results of knowing. So among them, the 6 perfect knowings of the abandonment of the discards of seeing are the results of forbearance. Forbearance here means the wisdom that actually eliminates the discards of seeing. It's a particular word for that level of wisdom that arises, that is the actual antidote for the kernels. And the rest, the perfect knowing of the abandonment of that which leads to the lowest, that is that which leads to the desire realm, plus that which leads to the form realm, as well as of all discards, are the results of knowings. The knowings are what comes out of the path of seeing. It's like, and so that is the word. You've got the forbearance, means the wisdom on the path of seeing that sees a level of the truth, and then you've got the knowing of that truth, and then you meditate on that knowing, on that knowledge, and that is the path of meditation. So which are the results of which levels? They're all results of not unable, 5 of the jhanas, or else 8. The 1 is of the preparations, 1 of 3 actual formless, 2. So here, that refer to the 9 perfect knowings, are all the results of the preparations of the first jhana, not unable. So this is a particular, when you are still in the desire realm, you haven't reached form yet, but you're on a particular level of the preparations that is called not unable. And the reason that it is called not unable is what's talked about in the next clause, as that level can act as the antidote for all discards. Undefiled not unable can remove attachment to all levels. So we will come to that quote in the next chapter. It's in the 6th chapter. So it's a level at which you can achieve liberation. You're still in the desire realm, but you can remove the you can eliminate all of the different afflictions when you're in that type of meditation. In the tradition of the Great Exposition, there are 5 perfect knowings that are results of the actual dhyana. So that means when you're actually on the in the form realm jhana meditations, there are the 3 of the abandonment of the discards of seeing of the 2 higher realms. You don't discard the discards of seeing of the desire realm because they've already been discarded if you're on dhyana. And the latter 2 perfect knowings, the abandonment of discards and meditation of the 2 realms. So what this is saying is that if you are in the dhyanas, then you can achieve the perfect knowing or the results of the cessation of a non-returner or an arhat, as well as the result of the path of seeing of in the higher realms. If you are on the basis of the dhyanas, the non-returners previously detached produce the path of seeing. So someone who has already developed dhyana meditation, when you see previously detached, that means someone who has already lost their attachment or abandoned attachment to the desire realm. And if they, on that level, you develop the path of seeing, you attain the 3 perfect knowings of the abandonment of the 2 higher realms, discards of seeing. And when they produce the path of meditation, they also attain the last 2 perfect knowings. So the 4 perfect knowings of the abandonment of desires discards, which are the 3 of the path of seeing and the 1 of meditation, have already been attained by the earlier level of not enabled. So they are not attained, they say. So that's according to the Great Exposition. The phrase "or else" indicates the position of Venerable Goshaka. I'm going too fast, and you're not going to get all of this, but don't worry. According to him, if the non-returners previously detached, that is, people, noble beings who are already detached, who before they became noble beings, before they became Buddhists, for example, they already developed the jhana meditations. If they produce the path of seeing on the actual practice of jhana, the 3 isolates, the perfect knowings of the abandonment of desires, discards of seeing, are individually obtained at that time. So Venerable Goshaka says that if you have already developed the dhyanas and you're in the on that level of meditation, and if that point you start doing, if you go through the path of seeing at that point, you also develop the mere isolate, basically a conceptual thing of the isolates. It's like it's not the actual thing. It's like the what do we say? It's a conceptual isolate of the perfect knowing of the abandonment. It's you have that isolate as opposed to the thing itself. It's like having the idea of it. So there are the 8 results of the dhyanas. They also, of course, obtain the isolate of the perfect knowing of the abandonment of that which leads to the lowest, but that is only attained incidentally with the perfect knowing of the abandonment of the higher realms, discards of seeing the path. So it is not counted separately, he says. So he's just drawing very fine distinctions here. Of the formless, there is 1 perfect knowing that is a result of the preparations for infinite space, the extinction of the desire for form. So when you're on the preparations for the formless realm, you can only achieve that one. It's a worldly, that one. That means that you abandon the form realm, you abandon attachment to the form realm, and which is extinguish the desire for form. This is a worldly path. In other words, this is not a noble meditation, but only nobles are presented as having perfect knowings as a result. So it is possible to attain undefiled removal. In other words, if a noble who has achieved the four dhyanas then wants to achieve the level of infinite space, they can either do it through a worldly path, or they can do it with, but they can also do it as a noble. It's a worldly path, but if they do it with the right motivation, essentially, then it is possible to attain the undefiled removal. And then the 1 perfect knowing of the total elimination of all fetters is the only result of the 3 undefiled actual formless. So when you have the undefiled meditations of the formless realm, there's only 1 perfect knowing you can achieve. So which are the results of what paths? There are all of the noble paths, 2 of the worldly subsequent 2. The 3 results of Dharma knowing, 6 of its similar kind, and 5. So the 9 perfect knowings, are all results of the noble paths. So they can all come through a noble meditation, because we have noble and worldly meditation, right? So they all result from the noble paths because they're results revealed by the Dharma and subsequent knowing of the path of seeing and meditation. So Dharma knowing is knowing things in the desire realm. Subsequent knowing is knowing things in the 2 higher realms. The two perfect knowings of that which leads to the lowest and the extinction of desire for form are the results of the worldly paths in noble beings. In other words, you're going through the worldly paths of achieving liberation from the level, but you're a noble being, so you achieve the noble path. The results of subsequent knowing on the path of meditation are the two perfect knowings too: the extinction of attachment to form and the total elimination of feather. So subsequent knowing is the meditation on the path is the wisdom on the path of seeing. So thus the three perfect knowings of abandonment of that which leads to the lowest, and so on, that which leads the desire for form and the extinction of all fetters, are the results of Dharma knowing contained in the path of meditation, because the Dharma knowing is the antidote for the discards of meditation of all three realms. So Dharma knowing is like you're actually seeing directly. Subsequent knowing is a little bit like inferential. So Dharma knowing, so the six perfect knowings, which is excluding the perfect knowings of the abandonment of the higher realms discards of seeing, are the result of its similar kind, Dharma knowing, including Dharma forbearance. And so similar kind here means both the Dharma knowing and the Dharma forbearance. This means the directly seeing the truth. And its similar kind. And the three perfect knowings, similar in kind to subsequent knowing, are five. The three perfect knowings of the abandonment of the higher realms discards of seeing, that are the results of subsequent forbearance and knowing, the last two perfect knowings. Okay. So establishing their quantity, there are 2 points. Establishing the quantity of the six of the abandonment of the discards of seeing, since they are an undefiled attainment of a removal, weaken the peak and utterly destroy two causes of their perfect knowings. So when we're talking about the discards of seeing, there are three. So because you group the suffering and origin are grouped together as one. So well then, it says, of those two types of discards, there are 8, 12, or 81 abandonings. So there shouldn't there be the same number of perfect knowings? 8 is when you count it in terms of the Four Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths for the desire and upper realms, 2 for each, that's 8. Or 12 is 3 for 8 each, dividing the form and formless into 3. 81 includes the the discards of meditation. So shouldn't there be the same number of perfect knowings? Like when you see the suffering of desire in the desire realm, you perfectly know it, don't you? So shouldn't there be the same perfect knowing? The answer is, first of all, since the removals that are results of the forbearances, that is the wisdom that is the actual antidote on the path of seeing, gain an undefiled attainment of a removal, weaken the afflictions of the path of existence, and discard and utterly destroy the universal of the two causes, suffering and origin. They are superior through three causes, so they're presented as perfect knowings. So you gain an undefiled result, and you weaken the afflictions for the peak of existence when you have gone through all three of these, and they destroy and the universals of the two causes, suffering and origins. So those two are combined together. So establishing the quantity of the three abandonments of discard, so transcending realms. Also, they're just called perfect knowing because they transcend realms, transcending form, formless, desire, form, and formless in that order. So the abandonment that is the result of knowing of the path of meditation attains the name perfect knowing through those three causes and from transcending any one of those three realms. So the discards of meditation have those three causes, plus they're transcending a realm. So how they're possessed by individuals, this is one of the aspects of the great exposition school, how something is possessed by whom. So not one. So you cannot only have one perfect knowing at a time. Those on the path of seeing may fully possess up to 5. Those on the path of meditation may possess 6 or 1 or 2. They are combined when one becomes detached from realms or gains a result. Excuse me, that not one at the beginning means ordinary individuals do not have one. Ordinary individuals do not have even one perfect knowing because they don't have any undefiled attainment of removal. Ordinary beings don't have that undefiled meditation yet. Those nobles on the path of seeing do not possess any up through the 5th moment. So on the path of seeing, when the first moment is the seeing suffering of the desire, is the forbearance of suffering of the desire realm, then there's knowing suffering of the desire realm, then there is seeing suffering of the 2 higher realms, then there's the forbearance of knowing the suffering of the two higher realms, and the forbearance of the knowing the suffering of the two higher realms. And then in the fifth moment, when you have the forbearance of seeing the suffering of origin, you get one, you possess fully one from the sixth moment, the knowing the truth of origin in the desire realm. And then two from the eighth, and so forth. Every 2 moments, you get another one. So this will be much clearer when we have gone through the 16 moments of path of clear realization. At this point, this is probably all like Greek to you. 2, 6, 8. So after, if you are interested in pursuing this more, after we have gone through the 16 moments of clear realization, then you should come back and read the section again, and it'll make much more sense. It's actually not that difficult if you know what all these moments are. The 16 moments of clear realization, 15 of which are the path of seeing. And so 1 from the sixth moment, 2 from the eighth, which is the subsequent knowing of the truth of origin, 3 from the 10th, the Dharma knowing of the truth of cessation, 4 from the 12th, the subsequent knowing of the path through the subsequent knowing of cessation in the higher realms, and up to 5 on the 14th and 15th moments. That means they have on the 14th moment, which is seeing the truth of the path and desire realm, then they have 5. And then the 15th, which is the forbearance of seeing it in the higher realms, that is, they have 5 on those two. The 16th moment is the path of meditation. So on that path, those nobles on the path of meditation who are attached to have regressed from the detachment, they possess the first 6, like on that 16th moment of clear realization, or if they have been previously been or later become detached from desire, they possess the one perfect knowing of the abandonment of that which leads to the lowest. That means the knowing of the extinction of the defilements for of the desire realm. Or if they are detached from form, they possess the 2 perfect knowings of the abandonment of the afflictions of form and that which leads to the lowest. Arhats possess the last single perfect knowing of the exhaustion of all defilements. So why are non-returners who are not detached from form and arhats presented as having 1 perfect knowing? Because on the path of seeing, you've got 6, and then you free yourself from the path from the desire realm, and you only have 1. What's that? And the reason is that that is the individual abandonments or the perfect knowings, are combined when you become detached from a realm or have newly gained a result. So they just combine them all into and they count it as 1. When these two are combined, the individual attainments of removal for each abandonment are forfeited and a single one is acquired. So the individual abandonments are combined and presented as a single perfect knowing. It's kind of like saying here, essentially, when you get to a new level of realization, it's like all your previous realization is consolidated and made into one. That's basically what it's saying. So forfeiting and attaining. It's possible to regress from the path of meditation. It's not possible to regress from the path of seeing. Once you've seen the truth, you've seen it. There's no regressing from that. But when you're on the path of meditation, it's possible to have freed yourself from the desire realm and then regress, to have a little bit of attachment for the desire realm. So it's possible. So that's what we call forfeiting. Some forfeit 1, 2, 5, or 6, or you can also forfeit them when you regress or at other times. At any rate, how many perfect knowings can one forfeit or attain? Some forfeit 1 perfect knowing. If one regresses from the state of an arhat or detachment, 1 perfect knowing is forfeited. For example, if you have that, you're an arhat, you've got that 1 perfect knowing of the extinction of all defilements, and then you regress. Then you lose that. The non-returners who attach from form forfeit 2 if they regress from detachment from desire. So if you're a non-returner, you've got 2. You've got the detachment from the desire realm and the form realm. You regress and you start having desire for the form realm. You've lost 2. Non-returners previously detached forfeit 5 when abiding in subsequent knowing of the path, or some forfeit 6 in instances when the successive non-returner has detached himself from desire. So the successive non-returner is one who's going through every stage in order. You go from the first form to the second, to the third, to the fourth, to the first level of formless, second, third, and fourth. So likewise, there can be attainment of 1, 2, or 6, but 5 cannot be gained because it is impossible to regress from a state of a previously detached non-returner. There is the attachment of 1 in instances such as when a non-returner attains arhatship. There is attainment of 2. So like when 2, when instances such as an arhat regresses through the afflictions of formless. There is an attainment of 6 in instances such as when an arhat or non-returner regresses through the afflictions of desire. So this is just a breeze through that passage without going into any detail. And this will all make a lot more sense when you have studied the later chapters. So if you would like to learn more about that, then it's better to go through it again at the end of this class. It's actually not that difficult. Okay, the second main part of this chapter is presenting the area's name. This completes the 5th area called Teachings on the Kernels from the Verses of the Treasury of Abhidharma. This completes the explanation of the 5th area called Teachings on the Kernels from the explanation of the verses of the Treasury of Abhidharma called The Essence of the Ocean of Abhidharma, the words of those who know and love, explaining youthful play, opening the eyes of Dharma, the chariot of easy practice. So that last one is the full title of Wangchuk Dorje's commentary. A few words here. The trunk of rebirth and stained karma's great tree is the kernels, the 2 types of discards. And if you should wish to uproot their attainments, their seed, as the Lord of twice drinkers, when scorched by the sun, the twice drinker is an elephant, because an elephant first sucks the water up into their trunk, then they put it into their mouth, and they squirt it down into their mouth. So they have to drink twice. When scorched by the sun, so on a hot day, when an elephant is scorched by the sun, what does it do? Dives into the lake spread with full lotus blossoms. So just as like those, you can't stop them when they want to go in that lake. If you've ever taken an elephant ride through a jungle someplace, you may have had this experience where they see the river and just jump right in or rush right in. So all those who have freedoms and riches and zeal should plunge into dharmas that classify kernels. So we should have the same enthusiasm for studying this as like the elephants. When satisfied sippling this nectar that is drunk, sippling is an old form of the word sipping, but I liked the way it sounded with that L in there, sippling. When satisfied sippling this nectar that is drunk, from the ladle of listening, contemplate well. In a place that is peaceful, one pointedly meditate how wondrous these victuals of undefiled bliss. Victuals is an old word for food. Maybe not that old. You can still see it in the names of restaurants sometimes, victuals, but people haven't really used it in conversation since sometime in the 19th century, at least not in America. Okay, those are the notes, which we don't need to go through. So now we get to the point. This is why I rushed through the last one. I wanted to get into something that's going to be a bit more germane for you right now. So the 6th area, the teachings on the paths and individuals. Paths. When you think of path, actually a path, it's kind of a metaphorical. What we're actually talking about is the wisdom. This is talking about the levels of the types of wisdom, the ways you go through, how you develop wisdom, and so forth. And the individuals means those individuals who are practicing on the paths. What are the different types of individuals? What are stream enterers? What are the different types of stream enterers? What are non-returners, and so forth? So all the different types of individuals. So here again, it begins, as with all the chapters, Wangchuk Dorje begins his commentary with homage and an homage or prostration, and with what we call a pledge to compose. To the all-seeing teacher, the physician for wanderers, to the unequaled Gautam, I prostrate. So this is the prostration to the perfect Buddha. And that term, the physician for wanderers, actually, I think one of the reasons why Wangchuk Dorje brings it up here is that this is a word this is explained in the section on one of the early verses. And which verse? And this is verse 3, verse 2. The description for verse 2 speaks a lot about the metaphor that we often read about the Dharma as being like medicine for ill people. So that's why I think or one reason why he perhaps was using that particular epithet here. The sixth part, the treasury that tells of individuals, the focus of two paths, the truths, the manner to train and abiding in discipline and listening, reflecting, meditating, how five paths arise, those who enter and dwell, the results of the spiritual factors, the treasury that fully classifies these is what I shall now explain. So here he's saying he's going to teach the topics of the chapter, and he's going through and he's giving you all of the focuses, the focus of the two paths. These are the worldly and the undefiled path. What are we focusing on? The truths, particularly the four noble truths, but also the two truths. And then how do we train them? Well, as Vasubandhu says, with conduct, listening, and contemplation, or completely train in meditation. So we have the manner to train in abiding in discipline. Talks about the first of these, and then listening, reflecting, and meditating. We have the three types of prajna that arise from listening, reflecting, and meditating. Then there are the five paths that you've all heard about, or that most of you have heard about. I shouldn't assume, but many of you have heard about the paths of accumulation, joining, seeing, meditating, and no more learning. If you haven't heard about them, don't worry. We will go through them in more detail than you could imagine. Well, maybe you could imagine more detail. We won't go into that high detail anyways. And then those who enter and dwell. So that means those people who are achieving a result and those people who have achieved a result. So those who are on the cusp of the result and those who have actually received the result, achieved the result. Then the results of the spiritual, these are the results of stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and arhat, and the factors, the 37 factors of enlightenment. So the treasury that fully classifies these is what I shall now explain. So this is all taught in the sixth chapter. So there's a lot of good stuff and a lot of stuff that is still important for us and in our practice now. So the sixth area, the teachings on the paths and individuals, has an explanation of the text of the area and a presentation of the area's name. So the first, the explanation of the text of the area, has three topics: an explanation of the paths, an explanation of individuals, and a specific explanation of the paths. That's where you get the real details. So the explanation of the paths has four topics. The first is the link between chapters. The second is the essence of the paths. The third is the focus of the paths. And the fourth is how the paths arise. So the first is the link between chapters. So this section reads, it's taught afflictions are discarded by seeing truth and meditating. So in the previous chapter, we were speaking about the afflictions. We spoke about the nature of the afflictions, the classifications, how they developed, and in the end, we spoke about the perfect knowings that are the abandonment of the afflictions. So how do we abandon the afflictions? By seeing truth and meditating. In the fifth area, abandonment is given the name perfect knowing. So as I said before, perfect knowing can be either the wisdom or it can be referred to the abandonment. And here we're primarily speaking about it as abandonment. With regards to that abandonment, it is taught, that is the abandonment of the afflictions, in other words, discarding or eliminating the afflictions. It is taught above, that is in the previous chapter, that the afflictions of it's taught above in the verse, that the kernels are discarded by seeing the truth, that is the path of seeing. This means the moments when you're first seeing the Four Noble Truths, which we've spoken about a bit, and we'll speak about more again. And by meditating on the truths, the path of meditation. So first you see the truths, and there's kind of a order that you go through of 16 different stages or moments that you go through that to lead to the realization of the truth. And then the 16th moment onward is the path of meditation, where you've already seen the truth. You just have to meditate on it. You have to kind of cultivate it in your being. So here it is those paths that abandon that are explained. In other words, the path of seeing and the path of meditation primarily. So the essence of the paths, well, when we're thinking about the paths, what are they like? Are they necessarily undefiled or are they defiled? In the beginning of the Treasury of Abhidharma, it says, defiled and undefiled dharmas. So it's as presenting the topic of the text as defiled and undefiled dharmas. So the paths are dharmas. Are they defiled or undefiled? And the answer is that the path of meditation is twofold. It can be either defiled or undefiled. But seeing, so-called, is undefiled. So the path of meditation can be either, but seeing has to be undefiled. The path of seeing is always undefiled. In other words, what we're saying is that the worldly meditations of the jhanas, or the non-Buddhist meditations of the jhanas, also are a path, and they're a worldly path. But they can't go through the path of seeing. That is specific to the Buddhist path. It is specifically undefiled. So which of those paths are defiled and which are undefiled, you ask? The path of meditation is twofold. So the path of meditation is twofold: the defiled worldly path and the undefiled transworldly path. Someone has their, hang on a second. Okay. Yeah, so the paths of meditation is twofold: the defiled worldly path and the undefiled transworldly path. In other words, you can do it either on a worldly meditation, worldly jhana meditation, or you can do a noble meditation. But the path of seeing, so-called, is transworldly. Transworldly, or some people translate this super mundane. I don't think there's a good translation. It's transcendent. It transcends the worldly. Undefiled only, because it's the antidote for all three realms, including the peak of existence, because it discards the 9 sets of discards of seeing of the 3 realms at one time, and because the worldly paths do not have such power to discard. So to go through these reasons why the path of seeing is necessarily undefiled, it's because, first of all, it's the antidote for all 3 realms, including the peak of existence. In other words, when you're on the path, when you're on a worldly path, you can eliminate the worldly paths can eliminate the afflictions for one level of samsara, like the level of desire, or one of the 4 levels of form, or one of the levels of samsara, of the formless, but they can't discard the antidotes for the form, for desire, form, and formless altogether. The path of seeing does. So that's one different. It's an antidote for all 3 realms. Now, the second is that it is undefiled because it discards the 9 sets of discards of seeing of the 3 realms at one time. So what are the 9 sets of discards of seeing of the 3? What do we mean here? Well, this means if you, we have mentioned this a couple times about the path of meditation, like when you are discarding the attachment to the desire realm to achieve form, you've got the greater of greater discards, the middling greater, the lesser greater, and so forth, the greater, middling, lesser, middling, then the greater, lesser, middling, lesser, and lesser, lesser. You've got kind of 9 gradations of discards. And you have 9 separate stages of successively stronger meditation that overcome those discards for each of the levels of samsara in the path of meditation. In other words, what you're saying is that you've got sort of 9 gradations of afflictions, of attachment for each of the realms. With the path of seeing, when you're thinking about it, actually, there are the same gradations of the discards of the path of seeing. But the difference is that you don't have to worry about getting rid of them all, getting rid of them one at a time. It's all at once when you see the truth. To give an example, like for example, with the discards of the desire realm, when we're talking about the discards of seeing form, you have the, like anger, you have levels of anger. Some people have like ferocious fury, and some people have like kind of very subtle anger, but there are different levels of anger that you can have. And so when you are going through the path of seeing, and you are discarding the anger of the desire realm on the path that is a discard of seeing suffering, for example, you discard that all at once, because it's all the same in towards sort of looking inwards and not being based on external things, but being based inwards on mistaken ideas of the self and so forth. So it is all discarded at once. And likewise with the anger that focuses on the other noble truths. You see the nature of the truth, and the discards, are all discarded at the same time, rather than going through in stages. The path of meditation, you're looking at external things, and the discards are more deeply entrenched, and so they're harder to get out, and you've already seen the truth. There's not a whole lot more truth to see. You just have to get more used to it. You have to get more accustomed to it. And so in that respect, you still have to go through 9 sets at a time. So the path of seeing goes through all 9 sets at once. So we don't really bother even to describe them as 9 sets. This is, I think, the only spot in the treasury where it is mentioned that there are 9 sets. Okay. And so, because the worldly powers do not have such power to discard. The last sentence it says here, and because the worldly paths do not have such power to discard. This means that the worldly paths do not have the same power to discard the personality view and the wrong view and so forth. Often because the worldly paths are kind of related with those. So the focus of the paths. So we're talking about the focus of the paths means what are you looking at when you are on the paths? Now the path, we have to remember that a path actually means wisdom. It means the path isn't like some footpath. It's not like anything like that. It's developing the wisdom, the stages that you go through in developing wisdom. So what are you looking at what are you meditating when you're on the path? You're meditating on 2 things. So there are 2 topics. Explaining the 4 truths, that is suffering, origin, cessation, path, or explaining the 2 truths, that is the ultimate and the relative. So here we have explaining the 4 truths. It's the essence of the 4 truths. The truths are 4, it is explained. So it's taught that there are the 4 noble truths. These are the truth of suffering, suffering, origin, cessation, and path. So they've already been taught, actually. They've already all been mentioned. When have they been mentioned? Back at the beginning of the 1st chapter. In the line, in the paths mentioned in the line by seeing truth, this is that line from the 1st chapter, from the 1st stanza of this chapter. So they've already been taught. And so the line, the undefiled is the truth of path. Now this is in the 4th stanza. It's the 1st line of the 4th stanza of the 1st chapter. In fact, all of these quotations here are from the beginning of the 1st chapter. So the undefiled is the truth of path. So that saying that explicitly teaches the truth of path. And then there's the line, cessation that is analytic explains the truth of cessation. So this is the 8th stanza of the chapter. An analytic cessation is a cessation that when you develop a power of analysis and you understand the nature of the afflictions, they cease. That cessation is called an analytic cessation because it arouses through the power of your analysis or wisdom. So that was also in the 1st chapter. And then the line, their suffering, origin, and the world explains the truths of suffering and origin. So here is saying the defiled aggregates. That means your form, feeling, conceptions, formations, and consciousness, when they're defiled, are necessarily the truths of suffering and origin. So that teaches all 4 back in the 1st chapter. Now then we have the question about the order of these. The suffering and origin, cessation and path. This is the order in which they are realized. I'm going to resize the screen and see if I can get all of that stanza on one. Here we are. Suffering and origin, cessation, and the path. This is the order in which they're realized. So you've got 4 truths, but we always say suffering, origin, cessation, and path. Why do we go through that order? Is this the only order that you could talk about them? Well, it's not the only order that you can talk about them, actually. There are many orders you can say. So what is this order then? They're in the order that they are in the truths of suffering and origin, cessation, and the path. This is the order. So here the word thus, that first word of the line, thus here, that word thus means that the essences are just as already been described. So they're what has already been discussed. So thus, they are presented in the order in which they are realized. So that means that when you're realizing them, first you realize suffering. And then you realize the origin or cause of suffering. When you realize the origin or cause of suffering, you realize that it can be stopped, and there is a cessation of suffering. And then when you realize that there's a cessation of suffering, then you realize the path, how to get to that cessation. So that is the order in which they are realized. So the reason is this: because on the path of seeing, one clearly realizes dukkha, or suffering, first, and then origin, cessation, and path. So that's the order in which you go through them on the truth of suffering. And so the reason for that is that on the paths of accumulation and joining, so the path of accumulation is the very first path, when you're accumulating merit, basically calming yourselves and developing your basic mode of meditation, so that you can, by the end of the path of accumulation, rest in one-pointed meditation. And then the path of joining is where you're really focusing on training and this conceptually. Then the truths are fully realized in that order. So the analogy that is given is that, like, when you see an illness, you think of its cause. Then out of the desire to eliminate the illness, you look for the method, which is the medicine. Like you see COVID, and you think about what is the cause? The coronavirus. And you realize that actually you can cure it or prevent it, which means that you are free of that illness and also free of its cause. In order to be free of COVID, you have to be free of the coronavirus too. And so you realize you can, and then you realize that there is a method, and that is a shot or two, right? So that is the medicine. So in the same way, you think of the suffering as like the illness. It's the illness of samsara. We often don't see it as being an illness. And then you think about, well, does that suffering have a cause? And you realize that it does have a cause. That cause comes out of a karma. And that karma comes out of the afflictions, primarily out of craving. And you think, is there a way to free myself of that suffering? You think, yes, there is. I can be free of that. And that is realizing the truth of cessation. And so what is the path? Well, the path is to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. It's a path of meditation. So that's like the medicine. So because only nobles see the truths from suffering to path as something just as it is, they are called the noble truths. Because ordinary individuals see the truths and so forth incorrectly, they are not called ordinary individuals' truths. So here we have a point. There's a distinction between the noble beings, that means the people who have actually seen the truth, and us ordinary beings who have not yet actually seen the truths. So like there's a difference. It's like the difference between knowing something intellectually and knowing it because you've seen it. You might have an intellectual idea about something and be able to speak about it quite a bit, but if you don't actually see it, there's like a different quality for what it is. You can read all about, and you can watch videos about Bodh Gaya, and you can think about, wow, that great sacred site, the Buddhists, the most sacred site in Buddhism, the place where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. The Bodhi tree is still there. And you can see videos, you can see pictures, there are probably dozens or hundreds of YouTube videos of the Bodhi tree and of the Mahabodhi temple. You can watch them. You can read all you want about it. But there's nothing, that's not at all like to actually going to the place and seeing it. It's not just that. I mean, not only with like a sacred place like the Bodhi tree or, sacred places, but anything. When you actually see it, you know it differently. So the noble beings are those beings who have actually seen it. The noble, or in Sanskrit, it's called Arya. So the Aryan beings, the noble beings, have seen the noble truths. They've seen the nature of truth, origin, cessation, and path. And so for them, it's real truth that they actually know. For someone like me, it's like a conceptual idea. I mean, I kind of get the idea. I can understand the reasoning why we say that the truth of suffering is suffering. And sometimes I can actually experience the suffering of suffering, but to really see the nature of samsara is suffering, I haven't seen it. I only have an intellectual idea of it. right? So I'm an ordinary individual. So I see the truths incorrectly, primarily in an intellectual way. So the difference here is how are you seeing it? Are you actually seeing it, or are you just kind of thinking about it? That's the main difference. So that's why they are called noble truths. When you talk about the Four Noble Truths, it doesn't mean that the truths are somehow some sort of exalted truth. It means that they're the truths that noble beings see. Actually, in the Tibetan and also in some of the Sanskrit, it's said clearly it's the truths, actually, and probably the more literal translation would be the truths of the noble beings. Right? So it's not that the truth itself is exalted, it's that exalted beings realize it. They're also exalted because they realize it. So that is what we mean by the term noble truth. Now, the other important thing to remember about the noble truths is that they are not something separate. They're not an abstract or a law. For example, you can think about the law of thermodynamics or the laws of relativity. You can say this is a truth. E equals mc squared is a truth, or mass equals force times velocity. That is a truth. When you're thinking about it in that way, it's kind of like abstract. An abstract principle that you apply to everything else. And this is, I think, particularly in Western thought, we have a tendency to think of truth as being some sort of abstract principle that is then applied to what you're looking at. But here, when we're talking about truth, we're not talking about that. When we're talking about the truth of suffering, what we are talking about is the actual defiled aggregates. That means the aggregate of form, feeling, conception, formation, and conception, the defiled aggregates of all five of these. And there's undefiled aspects too, but for the defiled aspects, those are the truth of suffering. Well, what is the cause of suffering? I mean, so what this is saying is that there is no truth of suffering separate from your body, your defiled body. There's no truth of separate well, I can't really say it like that. The truth of suffering is not separate from your defiled body or defiled feelings or your defiled conceptions or formations or consciousnesses. It's not something separate. It's not like some principle that you can learn from a textbook. It is the actual kind of nature of the defiled aggregates. And not just the defiled aggregates within your own continuum, but also the defiled aggregates outside. The trees and the sidewalks and cars and the mountains and so forth and rivers and so forth, those are also defiled aggregates. They are also the truth of suffering. The truth of origin is, the karma and afflictions. It's the actual, when you killed your neighbor last night, that is the actual cause, that actual act. It's not like some law saying that, it's just the actual thing. When you're talking about cessation, the truth of cessation is the actual cessation. It's not some principle. And the path means, as I've said several times already today, it means the wisdom, or the wisdom and everything associated with it that brings you along the path. So the conduct and listening, contemplation that produce the prajna, produce the wisdom, all of that is the truth of the path, right? It's not something separate. So that's an important point to understand, a difference between how we normally think of them. The truths are not an abstract, they're actually, they're what we experience, in particular with the truth of suffering. And so with the truth of suffering, it says, it's kind of an elaboration here, but this is an important elaboration. The attractive and the unattractive and the defiled other than those are suffering without exception because they have three sufferings. So, everything attractive, everything or pleasing, and everything unattractive or displeasing, and everything defiled is suffering. So this means even like I was saying, the mountains and rivers and so forth, these are also suffering. The truth of suffering. They're without exception. There's nothing. There is no defiled phenomena that is not. There's no defiled compound no defiled composite that is not suffering. So why is it that they are suffering? It's because they have the three types of sufferings: the suffering, the suffering of change, and the pervasive suffering of formation. So they all have these three types of sufferings. So they're the three types of suffering. The attractive are the suffering of change. So things that you find attractive are the suffering of change. It's like chocolate, oblivion, truffle tort, if you find it attractive, right? If you find it attractive, it is the suffering of change. And the unattractive are the suffering of suffering. So these are the things you don't like, that big needle that they're going to stick in your arm, or getting burned, or whatever. Anything unattractive, anything displeasing is a suffering of suffering. And the defiled, other than those two, are the suffering of formation. So in other words, you're kind of looking at it in terms of the feelings. So everything defiled without exception is suffering due to any one of three sufferings, because they, the defiled composites, have the three sufferings. So attractive, this means pleasant feelings. So again, chocolate, oblivion, truffle tort, but anything else that is pleasant. And when we're talking about the feelings, we're not just talking about the feelings, but also we're talking by extension about the things that produce those feelings, right? So there's the pleasure when you've got that chocolate, oblivion, truffle tort melting on your tongue. There's a pleasurable feeling, maybe. Not even necessarily. It's a pleasurable feeling. So that pleasurable feeling is a suffering of change. And the chocolate, oblivion, truffle tort that produces that is also a suffering of change. When you are being stabbed with a knife, the unpleasant feeling of pain is suffering of suffering, right? Or the suffering of, if you have an illness, right? That's that pain of the illness, the pain or discomfort of illness is suffering of suffering. But in addition to the actual feeling being suffering, that which causes it. So the knife that would cause, when you're being stabbed, the knife would also be considered the suffering of suffering. And then we have the pervasive suffering of formation. These are things that are neutral in feeling. So they aren't pleasure. They're neither pleasure nor displeasure. They're neutral. And so this might be, some tree over that you can see someplace else. Maybe it's just neutral, or something else that you see that's just neutral. Produces a neutral feeling. You can hardly feel it, right? And it's just neutral. So the three types of attractive and so forth appear in an order that is compatible with the three feelings. So pleasant feelings is suffering through change. As the Buddha said in a sutra, pleasant feeling is pleasant when it arises. It is pleasant while it stays. When it changes, it is suffering. So unpleasant is by its very nature suffering. The unpleasant is, as it says in the sutra, the feeling of suffering or pain. The word dukkha can also refer to pain. The feeling of dukkha is suffering when it arises. It is suffering while it stays. And it might be relief when it leaves, but I don't know. So feeling that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant is manifestly formed by conditions, so it is suffering only through formation, because it is said, whatever is impermanent is suffering. Anything that is impermanent is suffering. So here, when we talk about the three sufferings, it's primarily talking about them in terms of the feelings. So defiled composites that produce pleasant feelings are the suffering of change. Defiled composites that produce painful or unpleasant feelings are suffering of suffering, and any defiled composite that produces the suffering of that produces a neutral feeling would be neutral. And of these three, the easiest one is to see is the suffering of suffering. No one wants the suffering of suffering. The suffering of change is a little bit harder to see. With the suffering of change, you've got with the suffering of change, you have to recognize that the defiled composites are not actually, what do we say? that by their nature they're going to lead to suffering, that they are suffering, that they're going to lead to suffering, the suffering of change. This is a hard one to recognize. Often, when we use the word suffering, people only think of the suffering of suffering as being suffering, but actually we're talking about the suffering of change as well. And this suffering is something, the suffering of change is really very strong for the noble beings. It's stronger than for us because we just don't see it. We see pleasurable things and we think about the pleasure that we are experiencing now, and we're deluded by that, by our attachment to that pleasure. We don't see the pain that it becomes. For example, like when you meet someone and you're in a good relationship, you're in a good relationship for a while, but at some point that relationship is going to end, either through splitting up, divorce, or death, or some circumstance beyond your control. And I think, most of us understand that losing a loved one either through a disagreement and parting, or through death, or some circumstance beyond your control, beyond either of your controls, that's just suffering. There wouldn't be any world literature without this suffering, right? You think about it, from the very first world literature, what do we have? We have, Gilgamesh. That's a different one. But if you think about Homer, if you think about, at least in Western literature, we've got Homer, and what is he talking about? What's his name? The king whose wife Helen was taken. Was it Paris? No, Paris is, he was anyways, Agamemnon, whichever one it was. It doesn't really matter what his name was. He lost his wife. She went away, and she was beautiful too, so he was really bummed. So what did he do? He went off and went to war, spent 12 years. And all that suffering. There wouldn't be any world literature without that suffering of suffering. Or, the Anna Karenina and all those other great Russian novels. What is that? Suffering of change. So I think if we actually look at it and see it, actually the suffering of change is possible for us to see. The suffering of formation, though, is a little bit difficult. It's much harder. It's actually said that for ordinary beings, the suffering of formation just is beyond us. We just can't see it. And what it says in a sutra, and this is a very frequently quoted quote, is that if you have a hair and it's in the palm of your hand, you can hardly feel it. If that same hair gets in your eye, it's like you're going to completely just trying to get it out of your eye and blinking and so forth. It's really painful. So the suffering of formation for ordinary individuals is kind of like the suffering of a hair in your hand. You just don't notice it at all when it gets in your eye. But for the noble beings, it's like having that hair in your eye. And it's really extreme pain. So it's said that, as it notes in the Abhidharma, that when a noble being looks at the peak of existence, the highest level of the formless realm, a very extremely subtle level of meditation, where there is neither any pleasure nor any pain, and it's just completely smooth. Even that, when they look at that, the noble beings actually look at it with more fear and disgust than ordinary individuals do when they think of the lowest of hells, the unrelenting hell, or the incessant hell. If you think about it, when you read the descriptions about the incessant hell, maybe we don't read them so much, particularly in English, because they're not so frequently talked about. But when you read about that suffering of constant extreme agony for many eons, you think about that suffering, maybe it's too much for us to really get our heads around, but you think about it and you're kind of afraid of it. Well, the suffering, the noble beings, when they look at the suffering at the peak of existence, they have even more fear of that, probably from seeing where that's going to lead. The suffering of formation is really difficult to see, difficult to hard, and difficult to understand. So basically what it means is that it's the subtle impermanence of all phenomena. Everything composite is arising and ceasing in every moment. in every instant, in the indivisible instants that are the shortest moments of time. They arise, stay very, very briefly, and then perish, actually kind of all at the same time. And then they produce the next one and the next one, the next one. So everything is constantly being produced from moment to moment to moment to moment. It's such an extremely fast rate of speed that we ordinary individuals don't see it. We think of it as being all one thing. So when you see when you look at like the image of Kempo David splattering on a computer screen, it looks like it's one image that's happening, that's continuing for a period of time. But when you understand how a computer is put together, you realize that actually your screen is refreshing at, 60 times per second, or if you have a really good screen, 120 times per second, something like that. So 60 times per second, actually. So what looks like a continuous image of Kempo David blabbing on is actually so fast. It's just going back and forth so fast that you can't see it. So it's easy to understand that when we think about technology, because we can read the specs about monitors, or maybe you're not technical. If you're not technical, it's probably even harder to understand when you're thinking about it. But basically it's the images flashing and ceasing, flashing and ceasing. Well, our whole existence is like that. Everything defiled about us is doing that, and we just don't see it. Because it seems similar from moment to moment, we mistake it for all being the same. Right? But actually it's changing from moment to moment to moment. So that subtle impermanence itself is the suffering of formation. That's what the suffering of formation is. It's that subtle impermanence changing from moment every instant. So when you look at it, so why are we saying that is, why are we saying that is suffering of formation? Why is it suffering? Why is it painful? Well, the reason is because it's just kind of like this subtle discomfort. It just doesn't quite mesh with how we actually see things. In the auto commentary, it talks about how the suffering of formation is just slightly incompatible. Oh, it's incompatible with the way we see things. It's disagreeable. It's like this kind of like things aren't working out. They aren't how we think they should be. And because of that, there's this subtle level of suffering that we're not aware of. If you really look and you see the nature of the truths, then you see that it is suffering. But we haven't seen that yet. We can understand that. We're training to get to the point where we can actually see it, but we haven't actually seen it yet. And so that is the suffering of formation. So this is a difficult one to actually see and to understand. But what we're saying is that because things are changing from moment to moment and we don't realize that there's like this gap between our ideas and reality. And so because there's that gap or that conflict between the two, it's kind of subtle, unpleasant. It's kind of grating a little bit. I think we spoke the other day about the etymology of the word dukkha as meaning like the sound of cartwheel scraping in its axle when you have no ball bearings. It's like that sound. We've got that's I think the level of suffering that we're talking about here. So this level of suffering is just pervasive. It's an all compound phenomena. So all compound phenomena are impermanent. But here's the problem. Are all compound phenomena necessarily the pervasive suffering of formation? The answer is no, because we've also got the truth of the path. The truth of the path is impermanent according to, we're not talking Mahamudra and Dzogchen, we're not talking about Mahayana here, we're talking about the Great Exposition School. The meditation on the path is impermanent. It also changes from moment to moment. But it's not considered the pervasive suffering of formation because it isn't in discord. Because you're seeing, when you're on the truth of the path, you're actually seeing things how they are. It fits how things are. It is in accord with the truth. So it is not suffering. In fact, it is the antidote for suffering. Right? So it's not out of sync with the nature of things, and therefore it doesn't produce the suffering of discord. Now, you also might think to yourself, well, if the suffering of change is pleasant things and cause them, that means that there's no pleasure in samsara. And there's a long discussion of this in the Abhidharma. And the answer is that in the end, there is a real pleasure according to the Abhidharma. Of course, the great exposition, they're realists, so there is a real feeling of pleasure. Those momentary feelings of pleasure, those sensations are real things. You can't deny them, they actually exist. But when we talk about them, often when talking about the path, we talk about them as being painful. And you can think about the reasons why they're painful. There's a sutra that I'm not looking at it right now. It's basically saying that they are the causes of pain because they're produced by pain. So these are some of the reasons why the suffering. When you think about like chocolate, I think this is probably the last day that I can use this example. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to use it again. I might be able to work it in tomorrow. When you're thinking about chocolate oblivion truffle torte, it is a cause, it is pleasure, it's pleasant, it's a suffering of change. So well, how is it the cause of suffering? Well, if you eat too much, you are going to have insomnia, I promise you. Right? You have insomnia, you have other problems, you'll get a stomachache, and so forth, right? It's one way of looking at it. It is also produced by suffering. What is chocolate oblivion truffle made out of? Truffle cake made out of? It is produced out of chocolate, eggs, and butter. 3 ingredients. How do you get butter? These days you get it by mistreating dairy cows on factory farms, and I don't need to go into that. How do you get eggs? By treating chickens even worse. It's just a horrible life for chickens. And how do you get chocolate? Well, it's by, what happens to all those cocoa farmers in West Africa? How badly are they mistreated? Even if it's fair trade, they're not actually probably getting all that great a deal. And they go through a lot of work and suffering to do it. So it's produced, and then you do it and you make it and you have to work and you're sitting in a hot kitchen or you're standing in a hot kitchen doing work while you're making it. And so it's discomfort while you're making it. So it's produced by suffering. But the reason for thinking about this is not to say that the sensation of pleasure when you eat chocolate oblivion truffle torte or whatever your favorite food is a real sensation of pleasure. But when you teach like this, it's important for us to overcome our attachments to samsara and overcome our attachments to the pleasures of samsara. So when it is taught that it is completely suffering and that there is no pleasure attached, there is no real pleasure to it at all, because it is produced by suffering, because it is the cause of suffering, because attachment to it creates suffering, the reason that is taught is to increase our revulsion for samsara, because long as we are attached to chocolate oblivion truffle torte and all of the other pleasurable things that we experience, we are not going to be able to free ourselves from this suffering of the 3 realms. We are currently humans in a position where we can do something about it. But if we don't take this up, the chances of us coming back as humans next time around are incredibly, incredibly small if you just do the math. And so if we don't use this time now that we have right now, every year is just another year closer to our death. We don't know whether it's going to be tomorrow or the next time. And so if we really want to actually improve ourselves and actually achieve liberation for ourselves and others, instead of enjoying this time and having it all flame out at the end and end up, if we're lucky, a squid or some other, example like that. It could be a whole lot worse than that. The chances of us coming back human are small. And so we have to use this opportunity that we have now to see what we can do to make sure we do it. So at the very least, we can get a human body where we can practice the Dharma. At the very least. And that's, not a small thing. We've got a chance and we've got to use it. And what is it primarily that holds us back? It's our attachment to the pleasures of our lives. And so if we can think about things and think about these 3 sufferings and really internalize them, that's like a really important step that we need to take to be able to make any progress in our Dharma practice. So that's enough for now, enough for today. We will move on to the 2 truths tomorrow. So at this point, most of our questions have been coming over email. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them. Feel free to send them in, and we will recite. Oh, I've got a chat here. Let me take a look at this. Isn't it because we constantly make a mistake, the ignorance that arises in the possibility for ignorance? Let me see. Your mic is not connected. We do have a question. Let me see if I can. Can I help you unmute? Does that help you? Oh, there. I think you're on. Why don't you just? Okay, go ahead. You should be on. Oh, the mic's not working. Yeah. Okay. Oh, formation. Comment above relates to formation. So the formation is that we constantly make a mistake, the ignorant make a mistake, and the ignorance arises, and therefore the possibility for karma arises. So that's why it's the suffering of formation. When we talk about formation, there's the actual formation, the karmic formation, the performing karmic acts. That's also called formation. Here we're talking about things in terms of the suffering of formation. We're talking about phenomena coming together, arising and falling apart, forming and falling apart in every instant. So because it's impermanent, it's therefore kind of disagreeable, and therefore we call it suffering. When we talk about formation in terms of the promotion of karmic activities, it's like first you have ignorance. And when you have that ignorance, then you engage in a formation, which is a karmic act, and that produces the karmic result. And so that is somewhat. Now, all of the stages are actually composites. The ignorance is composite, the action is composite, the result is composite. So they're all also in some sense, the formation. Although the action itself, there is a disagreement among the scholars about whether the action itself should be considered the truth of the origin or the truth of the suffering, or both. And the great exposition position is that it's actually both origin and suffering. But the main thing here is that when we're talking about the formation, we're talking about the subtle impermanence. The ignorance is subtly impermanent. And our ignorance is perhaps that we're not recognizing the nature of the subtle impermanence and how everything's are arising and forming. So that is a level of ignorance. So thank you. Good question. So we will now recite the dedication prayers. So please think to yourselves that we should dedicate the merit of listening to and teaching the Dharma today as representative of all the merit that we and all sentient beings have performed in the 3 times. And think to yourself that you are dedicating it so that all sentient beings can realize the natures of the 4 truths and swiftly progress down the path to the lasting happiness of Buddhahood, where they'll be free of all the sufferings of birth, age, sickness, and death, and so forth. O sanam de tam je se bani 톱내nye 베라남 밤체테 제가나 지발롱초바이 시베솔레로 근윤로쇼. By this merit may we attain omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, and free all beings swiftly from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Chancho Samcho Rinpoche Make Panam Kejurachi Kepa Nyampar Mepar Yang Gonne Gondo Pelwar Sho. May bodhicitta great and precious rise in those who have not roused it, never weakening in those who have, may it grow ever stronger and stronger. So, thank you very much for listening. Okay. I see a question here that I'll speak about tomorrow. Next time. Okay, bye-bye.